I'd just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event, and I need to say that.
If King Charles collapsed tomorrow, the woman with the legal power to act in his place isn't his wife. It's his sister. May 6, 2023. Westminster Abbey. The eyes of the world are fixed on a golden coach moving slowly through the streets of London, carrying a newly crowned king. But look just behind it, and you'll see something that tells a far more interesting story than the coach itself. A woman in full military uniform, riding on horseback, positioned in the role of gold stick in waiting, a centuries-old office traditionally reserved for the one person a monarch trusts most intimately with his personal safety. That woman is not Camilla, the queen consort. It's Princess N, King Charles's younger sister. And if you understand what that placement actually means within the strange, symbol-heavy world of British royal protocol, you already understand the story this video is about to tell. Here's a question almost nobody inside the Royal Press Pack asks out loud, because the answer makes people uncomfortable. If something happened to King Charles tomorrow, who would actually have the legal authority to act in his place? Not symbolically, not ceremonially, legally, under British constitutional law. The answer might surprise you, because it isn't Camilla, it's Princess Anne, and the story of how she got there quietly, deliberately, over the course of 5 decades, is one of the most underreported power shifts in the modern history of the House of Windsor. To understand why this matters, you have to understand a piece of legislation most people have never heard of, the Counsellors of State Act 2022. This wasn't tabloid speculation or palace gossip. It was real, recorded, debated legislation, passed through both houses of Parliament in the final weeks of Queen Elizabeth II's life. Before this act, the standing list of people legally permitted to exercise the monarch's powers when he was unavailable, known as Counsellors of State, was governed by an old formula dating back generations. The sovereign spouse plus the next 4 adults in line to the throne. By 2022, that formula had created a genuine problem. The list technically included Prince Harry, who had relocated to California and stepped back from royal duties entirely, and Prince Andrew, whose public standing had been devastated by his own well-documented scandals. In practical terms, neither man was someone the institution wanted exercising state functions on the king's behalf in an emergency. So Parliament fixed it. Anne and Prince Edward were added permanently, for life, regardless of where they sat in the line of succession. That detail is crucial, and it's the hinge this entire story turns on. Camilla, as queen consort, is not on that list at all. She has no legal standing to act for the monarch in his absence, and does. This is the part most coverage skips over entirely. The difference between ceremonial prominence and constitutional function. Camilla wears the crown. She sits beside Charles at every state occasion, from the state opening of Parliament to royal tours abroad. She is, by every visual and ceremonial measure available to the public, the second most prominent figure in the royal household. But proximity to the throne and legal authority over its functions are 2 entirely different things. And in the British constitutional system, it's the second one that actually matters when a genuine crisis hits. Royal correspondent Valentine Low, author of the widely respected book Courtiers, The Hidden Power Behind the Crown, has spent years documenting exactly this distinction. The gap between who the public sees standing closest to the monarch at a gala dinner and who actually holds the legal machinery that keeps the institution functioning when the cameras aren't there. Robert Hardman, biographer of Charles III, New King, New Court, has made a similar case in his own reporting, arguing that the real story of this transitional period in the monarchy isn't found in who gets the best seat at a state banquet, but in who Parliament quietly decided could be trusted with the country's classified business when the king cannot attend to it himself. So why Anne specifically? The answer starts with a detail most people overlook entirely. She is only 2 years younger than Charles. That means she lived through the same defining political moments, the same constitutional crises, the same generational shifts in the institution that shaped his entire worldview. She doesn't need a crash course in why certain precedents exist within the family or the government. She was present when many of them were established. That kind of institutional memory cannot be manufactured or fast-tracked, and in a moment when the monarchy genuinely needs steady, experienced hands rather than fresh ones, it is worth more than almost any formal qualification you could hand someone. But the deeper reason runs through something more personal and frankly more remarkable. Anne's near total absence of dynastic ambition, a trait that has defined her entire adult life. Under the old rules of male preference primogeniture, the succession system in place when she and Charles were growing up, and was actually born second among Elizabeth's children, ahead of both Andrew and Edward chronologically. And yet she was steadily pushed down the line of succession simply because of her gender, eventually landing well outside any realistic path to the throne. It would have been entirely understandable for that to breed resentment over a lifetime. By virtually every documented account from those who covered her across the decades, including biographers and royal historians who've tracked her public life since the 1970s, it didn't. Instead of fighting for position or status, she turned her attention almost entirely toward work. Much of it unglamorous, much of it deliberately out of the spotlight. It's worth pausing here to remember just how early and how seriously and build her public reputation. Because it didn't start with red boxes or counselor status. It started on horseback and competed as an Olympic equestrian, representing Great Britain at the 1976 Montreal Olympics in three-day eventing. The only member of the British royal family to ever compete at an Olympic Games. She did so without the security of a private fortune cushioning every fall, riding through injuries, competing on merit in a sport where royal lineage means nothing once you're on the course. That experience, demanding, physical, entirely earned rather than inherited, shaped a public persona that has remained remarkably consistent for 50 years. No interest in performance for its own sake. Total focus on doing the actual work well. Then there's an incident from 1974 that rarely gets discussed in modern royal coverage, but says everything about who Anne actually is beneath the titles and the ceremonial roles. In March of that year, a gunman named Ian Ball attempted a kidnap Anne on the Mall in London, firing shots and wounding several people, including her bodyguard, in a botched plot to hold her for ransom. And by multiple contemporaneous newspaper accounts from the time, refused to get out of the car when Ball ordered her to, reportedly telling him, with remarkable composure under fire, that she simply wasn't going to do it. The attempt failed. Several of the men who intervened to protect her were later awarded the George Medal for bravery. That night revealed something about Anne's temperament that has held steady across the 5 decades since. A refusal to perform fear, panic, or helplessness, even when the circumstances would have justified any of the three. That steadiness is carried through into decades of humanitarian work that rarely makes headlines precisely because Anne has never sought headlines for it. She has served as president of Save the Children since 1970, one of the longest-running royal patronages of any working member of the family, and has traveled to some of the most difficult, conflict-affected regions in the world on the charity's behalf, often with minimal press coverage by her own apparent preference. Royal historians have repeatedly noted that Anne's charitable engagements have tended to focus on places and causes that offer little in the way of glamorous photo opportunities. Refugee camps, agricultural development projects, veterinary and animal welfare causes, rather than the more visually rewarding engagements favored by other branches of the family. That pattern, sustained across more than 50 years, is itself a form of evidence. It is very hard to fake 5 decades of unglamorous work. Now return to that key institutional choice, the one made quietly, without fanfare, decade before anyone outside the family was paying close attention. Anne's decision to turn entirely toward purpose rather than position. And that choice is exactly what makes her trustworthy with real authority now. Nobody in a room with Princess, and wonders if she's positioning herself for personal advantage. She cannot become monarch under any realistic scenario. There's no faction behind her, no rival camp using her as a vehicle for influence within the family's internal politics. In the high-stakes world of royal politics, where every gesture gets scrutinized for a hidden motive, that kind of transparent, ambition-free reliability is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable to an institution that has, at various points in its recent history, been badly damaged by exactly the opposite quality in other family members. The numbers back this up in ways that are easy to verify and impossible to dismiss as spin. Year after year, the official court circular, the published daily record of royal engagements maintained by the palace itself, shows Princess Anne completing more public duties than any other working royal, frequently exceeding 400 engagements annually. This isn't a single standout year driven by some unusual circumstance. It's been a consistent pattern. tracked by royal reporters and tallied annually by outlets, including the Press Association, for well over a decade running. While younger, more photographed royals dominate tabloid coverage and social media attention, and, now in her 70s, has quietly logged more actual hours of duty than almost anyone else carrying the family name. There's something almost defiant in that consistency. A woman decades into her public life, still outworking royals half her age, not because anyone is demanding it of her, but because the work has always, evidently, been the point for her. Look at the formal record of honors she's accumulated across her life, and the pattern becomes even clearer, almost like a quiet institutional paper trail, leading directly to this moment. In 1987, Queen Elizabeth granted her the title Princess Royal, an ancient designation that can only be held by one woman at a time, traditionally reserved for the eldest daughter of the reigning monarch, and carrying with an implicit expectation of lifelong, undivided service to the crown. In 1996, she was invested as a Lady of the Order of the Thistle, Scotland's highest order of chivalry, an honor that historians of the Scottish honor system have noted is never handed out for ceremonial appearances alone. It reflects sustained, substantive engagement, the kind built over years of actual relationship building in communities across the country, rather than scattered photo opportunities. And then there's the coronation itself, where we began this story. Charles appointed and has gold stick in waiting, a centuries-old ceremonial role traditionally reserved for the individual the monarch trusts most intimately with his personal safety. Royal commentators covering the event for the BBC and ITV noted the symbolic weight of that choice at the time it happened. On the single most important day of his reign, watched by hundreds of millions of people worldwide, Charles placed his sister, not his wife, in the most visually proximate position of trust available to him. There's a quieter story running alongside Anne's that deserves real attention here, because it illustrates something important about how the institution actually rewards loyalty over time. Vice Admiral Sir Timothy Lawrence, Anne's husband since 1992, entered royal circles in the mid-1980s as an equerry to Queen Elizabeth II, long before his relationship with and became public. Those who've written about the inner workings of the royal household, including Valentine Low, describe equerries as some of the most observant, least visible witnesses to how the institution actually functions on a daily basis, present for the unglamorous machinery that never makes the press. Lawrence has spent more than 3 decades supporting Anne's relentless schedule, without seeking visibility of his own, a role that by all documented accounts has required real personal sacrifice over a very long period. In 2011, Elizabeth honored him with a Knight Commandership of the Royal Victorian Order. More recently, Charles elevated him further to Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, the highest rank in that entire honor system, granted entirely within the king's personal gift, separate from any government or prime ministerial involvement. It's a small, easily overlooked detail in the broader sweep of royal news coverage, but it tells you something real. The institution has been quietly cataloging loyalty and reliability for a very long time, in places most people never think to look, and rewarding it when it finally matters most. Perhaps the moment that did more than any official record to reshape public perception of him came not from Parliament or the court circular, but from a BBC documentary, Charles III, The Coronation Year, broadcast in 2024 and covered extensively by outlets including the Telegraph and the BBC itself. In it, and spoke with unusual candor about her mother's final days at Balmoral Castle, revealing that Elizabeth had worried, even in her final weeks, about the logistical and governmental complications her death there might create for others, a detail that says a great deal about the relentless sense of duty that defined Elizabeth's entire reign, and described watching the imperial state crown lifted from her mother's coffin during the funeral procession, admitting to a feeling of relief, not because she wasn't grieving, she clearly was, but because she understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the family, exactly what weight that crown represented across 70 years of service, and that it had finally, after all that time, been set down. That kind of unguarded honesty about duty, about what the crown actually cost the people who carry for a lifetime, struck many viewers and longtime royal commentators as one of the most genuinely human moments British royal television has produced in years. It reshaped how a great many people, including seasoned royal watchers who thought they already knew Anne's public persona, saw her. None of this exists in a vacuum from what's currently happening with Charles's health. And that context matters enormously to understanding why this moment, specifically, has brought N's role into sharper focus. His cancer diagnosis, made public in early 2024, was itself a significant break from a monarchy's old instinct toward total secrecy around illness, an instinct that had defined the institution for generations. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, made a similarly public disclosure around her own health journey that same year. Taken together, these moments represent a genuine departure from a century-old palace strategy built on projecting an image of a family somehow above the ordinary struggles of human life, untouched by illness, fear, or vulnerability. In that context, it becomes far easier to understand why an institution managing real public vulnerability at the very top would lean more heavily on the one working royal with the legal standing, the experience, and crucially the complete absence of personal ambition to share the practical weight of governing during a difficult stretch. William, as heir, carries an enormous burden of his own during the same period, preparing for a role that would define the rest of his life, while also being present for Catherine's recovery and for 3 young children who need an engaged, available father during a genuinely difficult family chapter. N's documented willingness to carry more of the day-to-day institutional load doesn't diminish William's future position in any way. If anything, those close to family and several royal commentators have suggested it gives him something rare and valuable. Space, at precisely the moment when space is what he needs most. So, where does this actually leave Camilla, and what does it really mean for her position within the institution? It's worth being precise here, because precision matters more than drama, and the honest answer is more nuanced than a simple rivalry narrative. Camilla's position as queen consort is real, significant, and not under any genuine threat from this arrangement. She holds a title, the public role, the seat beside the king at every state occasion, and a public profile that has by most measures grown steadily more positive since Charles's accession. What she does not hold, and was never on the legal pathway to hold under the existing rules, is a formal place among the Counsellors of State, the small group legally empowered to act on the monarch's behalf in his absence. That distinction predates any of the current health concerns by decades. It's simply how the constitutional architecture of the British monarchy has always separated the role of consort from the role of blood relation, ceremonial prominence from legal function. What's changed, and what makes this particular moment genuinely significant enough to talk about, is that the person occupying that legal function is no longer a distant or purely symbolic figure waiting in reserve. It's a woman who has spent 50 years quietly proving, engagement by engagement, decade by decade, crisis by crisis, that she can be trusted with exactly the kind of responsibility that title implies. What you're left with, when you strip away the speculation and look only at what's documented, verified, and sitting on the public record, is still a remarkable story, arguably more remarkable than any invented headline could make it. It's the story of a woman structurally disadvantaged by the rules of her own birth, watching brothers leapfrog her in a line of succession she had no control over, who responded not with public grievance, but with 5 decades of relentless, often thankless work. From Olympic competition to humanitarian fieldwork to thousands of unglamorous public engagements most people will never read about. It's the story of an institution that, after watching 2 of its own become genuine liabilities through scandal and self-removal, quietly rewrote its emergency protocols to make sure the most reliable person available actually had the legal standing to act when it mattered. And it's the story of a king managing serious illness in unusually public view, choosing his most difficult moments to lean not on the most visible member of his family, but on the most trusted one. Maybe that's the real lesson sitting underneath all of this, the thing worth carrying away once the cameras stop rolling, and the headlines move on to whatever comes next. Power. The kind that actually matters in a monarchy built on centuries of careful constitutional balance, rarely announces itself with fanfare or dramatic press release. It accumulates quietly, year after year, engagement after engagement, decade after decade, until one day the people who run the institution look around and realize the person they trust most of the things that genuinely matter was never chasing the spotlight to begin with. She was simply doing the work, long before anyone thought to ask whether she'd earned the right to hold it. And in the end, that may be the most fitting tribute the modern monarchy could offer her. Not a crown she was never meant to wear, not a throne she was never meant to inherit, but something arguably rarer and harder won in royal life, an institution's quiet, hard-earned trust, Given not because she demanded it, but because across 50 years, she simply never stopped showing up. That here's an additional 1,000 words to extend the script. I've written it as insertable material covering Anne's Commonwealth diplomatic work. More detail on what Counsellors of State actually do, and a closing expansion on the institutional stakes. You can drop this in after the Timothy Lawrence section, and before the BBC documentary section, or wherever flows best for your pacing. It's worth understanding, too, what the role of Counsellor of State actually involves in practice, because the title sounds abstract until you see what it permits. A Counsellor of State can, under the Regency Act framework, carry out most of the monarch's routine constitutional functions when he is abroad or temporarily incapacitated. That includes giving royal assent to legislation passed by Parliament, receiving credentials from new ambassadors, holding Privy Council meetings, and signing routine state documents that require the sovereign's authority to take legal effect. These are not ceremonial gestures. They are functions with real legal weight, the daily mechanics of how the British state actually operates within its constitutional monarchy. A Counsellor of State acts in pairs by law, never alone, which is itself a safeguard built into the system precisely because the people who drafted it understood how much could go wrong if a single individual held that kind of authority unchecked, and has exercised these duties multiple times over the years, stepping in during periods when Elizabeth was abroad or otherwise occupied, building a track record of competence in a role that long predates the current moment. That track record matters enormously, because trust in institutions like the monarchy isn't granted in a single dramatic gesture. It's built incrementally, instance by instance, until a pattern becomes undeniable. Anne's diplomatic work across the Commonwealth deserves more attention than it typically receives, because it's arguably where her real political skill became apparent decades before most people were paying attention to her at all. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, as countries across Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia navigated the often difficult, sometimes painful process of redefining their relationship with Britain after decolonization, Elizabeth regularly sent and to represent the crown in situations that required genuine diplomatic sensitivity rather than ceremonial pageantry. These were not easy postings. They involved navigating complicated, sometimes openly hostile political environments, representing an institution with a complicated colonial legacy, and doing so in a way that maintained relationships without papering over real historical grievances. Royal historians who studied this period of her public life have noted that and developed a reputation among Commonwealth diplomats and Foreign Office officials for directness and substance, a willingness to engage seriously with difficult questions rather than retreating into vague pleasantries. That reputation, built quietly across hundreds of overseas engagements that rarely generated significant domestic press coverage, gave her a depth of practical diplomatic experience that few other members of the royal family then or now can claim. This matters for understanding the current moment because the challenges facing the monarchy today aren't purely domestic. Commonwealth relationships remain a genuinely important part of Britain's global standing, and a working royal capable of navigating those relationships with credibility and substance is a real institutional asset, not simply a ceremonial convenience. When people ask why Charles might lean on and rather than other family members during this period, her decades of substantive international experience are part of the answer, even if it's a quieter, less visually dramatic part than the coronation procession or the red box symbolism that tends to dominate headlines. It's also worth returning briefly to what Queen Elizabeth was actually doing in the final period of her reign, because the Counsellors of State Act fits into a broader, well-documented pattern of institutional planning that intensified noticeably in her last years. Biographers including Robert Hardman have written extensively about how deliberately Elizabeth approached the question of what kind of monarchy she would leave behind for her son, particularly after watching the institution absorb real reputational damage from the conduct of Andrew and the departure of Harry and Meghan. The Counsellors of State Amendment wasn't an isolated legal fix. It sat alongside other quieter adjustments Elizabeth made in her final years, changes to working royal arrangements, decisions about which family members would retain official roles and which would not, all pointing toward the same underlying goal: leaving Charles with an institution structured around people who had actually earned their positions through sustained, demonstrated reliability, rather than people who held them purely by accident of birth order. Anne's elevation within that structure wasn't a single decision made in isolation. It was a visible result of a much longer, more deliberate process of institutional design. None of this is to suggest that Camilla's position within the monarchy is somehow precarious or under threat, and it's worth being clear about that one more time before closing. Royal commentary that frames this as a rivalry, a winner and loser narrative between two women competing for the king's trust, tends to flatten what is actually a far more interesting and more accurate story about institutional design. Camilla's role as queen consort serves a different function within the monarchy than Anne's role as a counselor of state, and the two were never built to compete with one another in the first place. Camilla's public standing has, by most